So now we're going to go deeply into the loving kindness meditation. And I just want to review the steps again. So we've been practicing Lord Jigten Sumgon's meditation training on loving kindness, which is very, very simple. We contact the feeling of loving kindness. And one of the most accessible ways is to imagine a loving, a sweet little baby smiling and laughing coming towards you. So you notice the heart opening feeling of just unconditional love. Your defenses are collapsed because it is just this situation where this beautiful being is walking towards you, and their innocence and your innocence allows loving kindness to be undefended and open. Once you find a way to contact that feeling, and this may take time, you then drop the story that allowed you to contact it and just rest in that feeling. So you allow it to build in strength, you allow it to feel really full, whether it's coming from you looking at something lovable or someone loving you with that strength. You just rest in what it feels like until you feel you have grown in capacity and you see nuances and fluctuations fairly clearly. Oh, I've been distracted, so all of a sudden the strength of the feeling is down. Or I've allowed it to just diminish. Let me pull the strength back up. So then once you have worked with it in this way for several weeks, then we begin the practice of expanding that loving kindness. And this is another way to really encounter our shadow side, as well as grow in our capacity. So it's very interesting. And if you remember the opening prayer, when we're talking about this, we're saying, may all sentient beings, including the enemy who hates me. So what we're saying is, we're going to make our bodhicitta, our loving kindness, so strong that we have a sense of equanimity within that loving kindness. So no matter who arises on our path, the strength of that bodhicitta doesn't diminish. So I want to focus a little bit longer on this view because it's very interesting. When we say, may we become Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in order to benefit sentient beings, the quality of Buddhahood is this equanimity in great compassion and loving kindness. And when I'm trying to think about what that means and what that's like, I start imagining what it feels like to have loving kindness with equanimity. So that means that the Buddha, imagine you're the Buddha gazing out at all sentient beings, you have perfect equanimity towards all the sentient beings. One of the examples is that this radiating loving kindness and compassion is like sunlight. It doesn't fall more on one person than another person. It doesn't choose which person to fall on. It is just this great strength of compassion flowing out, this strength of loving kindness. So imagine you are reversing positions and you're the Buddha looking out with that kind of equanimity. And that would mean that there's no worthy and unworthy. For instance, if we think of our least favorite politician and our most favorite person, that beautiful loving kindness and bodhicitta is flowing equally to both of those beings at the same time. There's no perpetrator and victim from the perspective of the Buddha's perfect loving kindness. It's going equally to both of those beings. There's no more worthy and less worthy. It is flowing out like sunlight. So this is the view of the fruition of this practice, which if you then contemplate, well, how interesting, of course, on the one hand, there's justice and injustice. Yes, this is true. But in terms of the loving kindness flowing out and the gaze of the Buddha addressing each being's Buddha nature, not their confusion, we are trying to move towards the absolute, to the perspective of the Buddha. And what we start to realize is that when we are holding on to a sense of perpetrator, a sense of worthy and unworthy, a sense of this person injured me and I am the injured, we are actually hurting inside with these thoughts. It hasn't got anything to do with the outside reality. It has to do whether our heart is healing from our woundedness or is holding on to the wound, even though the wound is in the past. So over time, we start to see that holding on to thoughts of hatred and thoughts of victim is actually something that hurts us mentally. And so this is separate from actual actions in the world that are happening. It's more, what is the perspective? Can we move to the perspective of the Buddha, and can we heal the wounds in our heart? And so we are able to extend that loving kindness to all sentient beings. So I want to read you a quote from Pema Chodron, which addresses our instinct to want to protect and to want to hold on to that sense of being injured. We think that by protecting ourselves from suffering, we are being kind to ourselves. The truth is, we only become more fearful, more hardened, and more alienated. We experience ourselves as being separate from the whole. This separateness becomes like a prison for us, a prison that restricts us to our personal hopes and fears, and to caring only for the people nearest to us. Curiously enough, if we primarily try to shield ourselves from discomfort, we suffer. Yet when we don't close off, when we let our hearts break, we discover our kinship with all beings. So it really has to do with understanding the relative and the absolute. In the relative, we may need actual healing. This is very true. In the absolute, we are moving towards this equanimity of loving kindness that is reflecting our healed state. And so I want to start this today with also the caveat that when we move into this meditation, first we want to be assured of our own physical and psychological safety. So there's a wonderful sutra from the Buddha, and it's called something like the brambles and the thickets. And it's an admonition that if you are in a situation where your mind can't be calm, if all the outer circumstances are difficult, even if the house is nice, even if the food is good, if the circumstances are so difficult, leave immediately. So this means we attend to our personal and psychological safety. And this may mean many other kinds of practices and various therapies, etc. But this meditation is something that we want to do from the wholeness of our heart, and how to discover where our wounds are and where the necessary healing needs to take place. And we have to begin with a certain degree of strength in order to do that. So the meditation can be done in so many different ways. And this is one of the reasons I find it so rich. We're in the strength of that feeling, and we allow that open, unconditional loving kindness to start to flow out. And the traditional instructions are to allow it to spiral out, and to spiral out eventually in all the 10 directions into the 3,000 world systems. So that's how simple the instructions are. So in our practice of it, it means we can start in our home, at our family dinner table. We can start at our neighborhoods. We can start in our offices. And we allow the love to flow out with this extraordinary, unconditioned equanimity in the loving kindness. And you might start with just your biological or chosen family sitting down together for a celebration or a meal. So it starts to flow out, and allowing yourself to be that open can be frightening at first. You can start to see what it's like to be totally undefended, and it's like the door shuts immediately. It's so scary. So no problem. The interesting nuance in Lord Jigten Sumgon's instruction is anytime there's a fluctuation of the strength, you stop, you go back, you contemplate the feeling, you sit with the feeling, you deeply contact it, sit with it without the story, and then you begin again. So eventually, this imaginary table is going to hold lots of different people. So it may hold those who are easy to love. It may hold those you don't know too well. And eventually it's going to hold people who are difficult for you and people who've actually hurt you. You get to decide how this happens for you. And it is absolutely a lifetime process. So you may feel I can just start and I can work with who's ever at my family table. There's no one that's too difficult here. And so then you look at the fluctuations. Still, there will always be degrees with the different people who arise in your imagination, even if they're people that you're relatively comfortable with. And then once you see the strength not fluctuating with the group we might call beloved, then they're the people that you don't know well. And that gets even more interesting. How is it that we can see the hopes and dreams and fears and heartbreak of strangers with the same degree of loving kindness that we see those beloved? So we know when it's folks that are beloved to us, we are sitting there with open hearts. We are sitting there listening. We're ready to act in any way. We're ready to give our resources in any way that we can help. So every time we're then starting to work with strangers and we see the fluctuation in our openness, in our unconditioned bodhicitta, then we stop and go back to contacting the feeling. So this is a whole amazing kind of investigation in itself, just opening your heart further and further with the same degree to people you don't know at all. And it's surprising. It's surprising in that even professionally, we are taught to have boundaries. And we think that these boundaries protect us. But this is really an exercising in making these boundaries more and more translucent, more and more permeable, so that we begin to hold the pain of others in the same way that we hold the pain of ourselves and our families. And it eventually moves us to action. But first, being willing to be open to many different kinds of people. The third stage is often the most difficult stage. And that's when it's the people who are difficult for you, who are ones that have hurt you, that you feel wounded by. You may have to go back over and over and over again to contacting the feeling. And I would say that you can work with some of these people in your lives, especially when we've experienced psychological trauma or even physical trauma for years and years and years and years. No problem. In the sense that I want you to have realistic expectations that it's not a one-day thing and it's not a should thing and it's not a thing that you have to do it right away. It's more saying that any kind of narrowness of heart hurts us. And when we can extend a sincere loving kindness to the person who's injured us greatly, then we don't have the weight of that history on our shoulders anymore. It doesn't mean that we change what is safe in our behaviors. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us if we can't do it right now. It's more an aspiration not to have hatred. Because the hatred harms us. So I always go back to the sutra where the Buddha talks about ending hatred can be so difficult and painstaking, it's like a snake shedding its skin. And I like that example because it's so very visceral that it would take such a long time to move the skin cell by cell to just sort of shift that. So in this process, which I find really tremendously interesting over time, when you go back to, all right, this person is a stranger to me, or this person has done me a slight injury, this is my office worker who's such a pain to work with, all those things, we have to go back and sit in that loving kindness, but we can also use investigation as to who was hurt. Why is it that this situation, that this kind of hurt wounds me so deeply? Other things don't wound me so deeply. So we start to see that in our psychological makeup, we have different kinds of injuries that are more difficult to recover from than others. And so we go, oh, isn't this interesting? I'm looking at this meditation and I may see that I have 2 or 3 difficult people, totally different times in my life, totally different situations, but the hurt in my heart has to do with this aspect of I. Like, I was unfairly blamed for something, or they took something that was mine. We have the worldly concerns that talk about what normally gives us great displeasure and gives rise to conflict in terms of the worldly concerns of wanting gain and not wanting loss, wanting pleasure and not wanting pain. They hurt me, they hit me. Wanting praise and not wanting blame, wanting fame, a wonderful reputation, and not wanting disgrace. So we can start to key into that this connection of the block to this open, undefended loving kindness on our side has to do with some aspect of holding on to a sense of an unchanging, independent I. And that is a whole other investigation that we can work with. But I wanted you to see how similar this was to the investigation that we went through previously in the Tonglen meditation, when we saw in a different way that all of a sudden we had to protect ourselves from what was coming in from the outside. Now we're seeing, oh, when I try and radiate loving kindness from inside to outside, there's also a door slamming shut that has to do with some sort of protection about some sort of an I that I experience, but may not be quite what I think it is. So let's see what it feels like today, knowing that it really and truly is up to you who is at the table or who is in your neighborhood that you're working with. And that as you see your loving kindness going out and it fluctuates in strength, then you go back to sitting in the loving kindness. So there's no perfect way to do it. It's whoever arises in your imagination, however you'd like to experiment with it. Remembering to smile and putting your right hand on your knee and your left hand in your lap in the position you often see the Buddha. Giving rise to that strong feeling, then allowing that feeling to flow out.